The Cold War. It wasn't a war with guns and bombs, but a war of ideas. It lasted for almost half a century, from the end of World War II until the early 1990s. On one side stood the United States, a capitalist democracy. On the other side stood the Soviet Union, a communist dictatorship. These superpowers never directly fought each other, but they came very close to nuclear war several times. This essay will delve into the historical circumstances that led to the Cold War. We will explore the ideological differences between the US and the Soviet Union, and we will examine the key events that marked the beginning of this tense standoff. After World War II, Europe was left in ruins. The devastation was immense, and the continent was in desperate need of rebuilding. This period of reconstruction was not just about physical structures, but also about political ideologies. The United States introduced the Marshall Plan, a massive economic aid package to help rebuild Western European economies. This was not just an act of generosity, but also a strategic move to prevent the spread of communism. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was expanding its influence in Eastern Europe, establishing communist governments in countries like Poland, Hungary, and East Germany. This expansion was seen as a direct threat by the United States and its allies. One of the first major confrontations of the Cold War was the Berlin Blockade in 1948. The Soviet Union blocked all ground routes into West Berlin, attempting to force the Allies out of the city. In response, the United States and its allies organized the Berlin Airlift, supplying the city by air for almost a year. The Korean War, which began in 1950, was another significant event. North Korea, supported by the Soviet Union and China, invaded South Korea. The United States and other Western nations intervened to support South Korea, leading to a brutal and bloody conflict that lasted until 1953. Perhaps the closest the world came to nuclear war was during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the US coast. After a tense 13-day standoff, the crisis was resolved when the Soviet Union agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for the US promising not to invade Cuba. Espionage played a significant role during the Cold War. Both sides engaged in extensive spying operations, trying to gather intelligence and outmaneuver each other. This era saw the rise of famous spies and double agents, adding another layer of intrigue to the conflict. The Cold War also extended into space. The space race was a competition between the United States and the Soviet Union to achieve significant milestones in space exploration. It began with the Soviet Union launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, in 1957, and culminated with the United States landing the first humans on the moon in 1969. The Cold War had a profound impact on culture, politics, and society. It influenced everything from movies and literature to education and technology. The fear of nuclear war and the constant tension between the superpowers shaped an entire generation's worldview. The Cold War finally came to an end in the early 1990s with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. This marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new chapter in global politics. The legacy of the Cold War continues to influence international relations today. Understanding this period is crucial to comprehending the current geopolitical landscape and the ongoing tensions between former Cold War adversaries. World War II was a global conflict that lasted from 1939 to 1945, involving most of the world's nations, including all of the great powers, eventually forming two opposing military alliances, the Allies and the Axis. The war caused unprecedented destruction and loss of life, devastating much of Europe and Asia. Cities were reduced to rubble, economies were shattered, and millions of people were displaced. The United States and the Soviet Union, despite their ideological differences, fought together as allies against the common enemy of Nazi Germany. Their cooperation was crucial in achieving victory. However, even before the war ended, tensions began to emerge between the two superpowers. These tensions were rooted in their vastly different political ideologies and visions for the post-war world. The Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, had suffered tremendously during the war. The Eastern Front was the site of some of the largest and bloodiest battles, and the Soviet Union bore the brunt of the fighting against Nazi Germany. Millions of its citizens were killed, and vast areas of the country lay in ruins. The war left deep scars on the Soviet Union, both physically and psychologically. In response to these immense losses, Stalin was determined to create a buffer zone of friendly communist states in Eastern Europe to protect the Soviet Union from future invasions. This involved the establishment of pro-Soviet governments in countries like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. The United States, on the other hand, emerged from the war as the world's dominant economic and military power. Its industrial capacity had grown significantly, and it had not suffered the same level of destruction as the European and Asian nations. The US was wary of Stalin's ambitions and sought to contain the spread of communism. This policy of containment was articulated in the Truman Doctrine, which pledged support for countries resisting communist subjugation. This marked the beginning of the Cold War, a period of geopolitical tension between the United States and the Soviet Union that would last for decades. To rebuild and stabilize Europe, the United States launched the Marshall Plan, providing over $12 billion in economic assistance to help rebuild Western European economies. This was also aimed at preventing the spread of communism by promoting economic stability and prosperity. One of the first major crises of the Cold War was the Berlin Blockade in 1948, where the Soviet Union blocked all ground access to West Berlin. In response, the United States and its allies organized the Berlin Airlift, supplying the city with food and fuel by air for almost a year. In 1949, the United States and its Western allies formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a military alliance aimed at countering Soviet power in Europe. This further solidified the division of Europe into Eastern and Western blocs. The Cold War soon spread beyond Europe, with conflicts erupting in Asia. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, saw the United States and its allies supporting South Korea against the Communist North, which was backed by China and the Soviet Union. The Cold War was also marked by a nuclear arms race, with both the United States and the Soviet Union amassing large arsenals of nuclear weapons. This led to a precarious balance of power known as mutually assured destruction, MAD, where both sides had the capability to destroy each other in the event of a nuclear war. The competition between the superpowers extended to other areas as well, including the space race. The Soviet Union launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik, in 1957, and the United States responded by landing the first humans on the Moon in 1969. Throughout the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in numerous proxy wars, supporting opposing sides in conflicts around the world, from Vietnam to Afghanistan. These conflicts often had devastating consequences for the countries involved. The Cold War finally began to wind down in the late 1980s with a series of events that led to the collapse of communist regimes in Eastern Europe. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 symbolized the end of the Cold War and the beginning of a new era in international relations. At the heart of the Cold War was a fundamental clash of ideologies: capitalism versus communism. This was not just a political or military standoff, it was a battle for the hearts and minds of people around the globe. The ideological divide was stark and uncompromising, setting the stage for a prolonged period of tension and competition. The United States championed capitalism, a system based on free markets, private property, and individual liberty. Capitalism was seen as a pathway to prosperity and innovation, where individuals had the freedom to pursue their own economic interests. The American dream was built on the idea that anyone, regardless of their background, could achieve success through hard work and determination. The Soviet Union, in contrast, adhered to communism, a system that advocated for a classless society where property and wealth were collectively owned and controlled by the state. Communism promised equality and aimed to eliminate the disparities between the rich and the poor. It was a vision of a society where everyone contributed according to their ability and received according to their needs. These opposing ideologies created a deep mistrust between the two superpowers. The United States viewed the spread of communism as a threat to freedom and democracy, while the Soviet Union saw capitalism as a system of exploitation and inequality. This mutual suspicion fueled an arms race and a series of confrontations that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Both sides believed their way of life was superior. The United States saw itself as the defender of the free world, promoting democracy and human rights. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, saw itself as the vanguard of a global revolution, fighting against imperialism and capitalism. This sense of ideological superiority drove both nations to compete fiercely in various arenas, from space exploration to sports. Both sides sought to spread their influence around the world. The United States formed alliances with Western European nations through NATO, while the Soviet Union established the Warsaw Pact with Eastern European countries. Each superpower aimed to expand its ideological reach by supporting friendly governments and movements in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. This global competition often led to interventions and conflicts in third world countries. This ideological conflict would shape the Cold War and its many proxy wars in the decades to come. From the Korean War to the Vietnam War, from the Cuban Missile Crisis to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the struggle between capitalism and communism played out on a global stage. These proxy wars were not just military battles, but also ideological contests, with each side trying to prove the superiority of its system. The Cold War may have ended, but the clash of ideologies continues to influence global politics to this day. As World War II ended, Soviet troops occupied much of Eastern Europe. Stalin quickly moved to install communist governments in these countries, creating a bloc of Soviet satellite states. In 1946, Winston Churchill, the former British Prime Minister, famously declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, dividing the continent into two hostile camps. Faced with the growing Soviet influence in Eastern Europe, the United States adopted a policy of containment. This policy, first articulated by President Harry Truman in 1947, aimed to prevent the further spread of communism. The Truman Doctrine pledged American support to any nation threatened by communist expansion. This marked a turning point in US foreign policy, signaling a shift from isolationism to active involvement in global affairs. In 1948, the United States launched the Marshall Plan, a massive economic aid program to help rebuild war-torn Europe. The plan provided billions of dollars in aid to Western European countries, helping them to recover economically and resist communist influence. The Marshall Plan was a huge success, revitalizing the economies of Western Europe and strengthening ties with the United States. It also highlighted the stark contrast between the prosperity of the West and the economic stagnation of the Soviet bloc. In 1949, the United States and its Western European allies formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. NATO was a military alliance that committed its members to collective defense. This meant that an attack on one member would be considered an attack on all. The formation of NATO further solidified the division of Europe and heightened tensions with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union viewed NATO as a direct threat to its security. In 1955, it responded by forming the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance of communist states in Eastern Europe. The Warsaw Pact formalized the military division of Europe and intensified the Cold War rivalry. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel for more content.